The storm raged outside, lightning slashing the sky. In the dimly lit nursery, two massive German shepherds lay motionless, eyes fixed on the crib. Thena creak. A shadow moved. Instantly, low growls filled the air. Someone had come. The sprawling estate stood in eerie silence, its vast corridors echoing with the weight of solitude. Outside, the city buzzed with life, but within these towering walls there was only emptiness. Nathan Calloway, a self-made millionaire, sat in his dimly lit study, the golden glow of his whiskey reflecting off the polished mahogany desk. His fingers traced the rim of the glass absent-mindedly, his mind trapped in a place much darker than the room around him. For years he had built an empire, brick by brick, deal by deal, ensuring his name was etched into the annals of success. Yet for all his wealth, he had nothing to hold on to nothing except a heavy heart and the suffocating silence that came with it. The mansion, though grand, was hollow. It lacked the warmth of laughter, the echo of footsteps that weren't just his own. A framed picture sat on the desk, its edges worn from the countless times he had picked it up, only to put it down again. It was of Evelyn, his late wife, holding their newborn daughter Elise. The moment had been frozen in time, her radiant smile, the softness in her eyes as she cradled their child. But that moment was long gone, stolen away by a cruel fate that had no regard for love or loss. Evelyn had died in childbirth, and Nathan had never forgiven himself. Guilt gnawed at him like a relentless tide, eroding whatever peace he tried to build. He had everything, a fortune that could buy the world, but the one thing he had ever truly wanted had slipped through his fingers like grains of sand. Now he was left with Elise, the only remnant of the love he had lost. But love, he didn't know how to give it. His entire life had been about numbers, strategy, and control. Love was chaotic. Love was unpredictable. And Nathan had no idea how to be a father. That was why he had Titan and Echo. Two colossal German shepherds. Their imposing figures were the only presence in the mansion that Nathan found comforting. He had trained them himself, poured every ounce of discipline into them, molding them into guardians rather than pets. They were fierce, loyal, and obedient qualities Nathan understood. But even they had changed. Since the day Elise had entered their world, the dogs had become something else entirely. No longer just protectors of the house, they had become something more, her protectors, her pack. Nathan had seen it in their eyes, the way their instincts had shifted. He was no longer their priority. Elise was. And though he had spent years shielding himself from attachments, from the pain of losing someone again, he was beginning to realize something terrifying. Elise wasn't just Evelyn's daughter. She was his. And she was the only thing that truly mattered. The first time Nathan had truly understood the depth of Titan and Echo's bond with Elise was on a cold winter morning. He had stepped into the nursery, expecting to find his daughter sleeping peacefully in her crib. But instead, he had found her nestled between the two giant dogs, their thick fur cocooning her small frame like a living fortress. Elise, barely 6 months old, had her tiny hands buried in Titan's fur, her head resting against Echo's massive paw. For a brief second, fear had gripped Nathan's chest. They could hurt her. They could crush her. But as he took a step closer, he realized there was no danger here. Titan lifted his head slightly, ears twitching as he acknowledged Nathan's presence. Echo barely moved, except for the slow rise and fall of his chest as he breathed in sync with Elise's own tiny inhales. It was then that Nathan saw it something primal, something ancient. This wasn't just a bond. It was devotion. The way they lay beside her, their bodies positioned in a way that shielded her from every angle, their eyes half-lidded but alerted, was the kind of protection that didn't come from training. It came from love. Nathan had spent his life building walls, refusing to let himself feel too deeply. But seeing the way these creatures, beasts that had once only obeyed commands, had given their hearts so effortlessly to Elise, something inside him cracked. He knelt down beside them, hesitating before reaching out. Titan didn't move. Echo didn't flinch. And then Elise stirred. Her tiny fingers uncurled from Titan's fur as she let out a soft sigh, shifting slightly before settling once more. Nathan's throat tightened. He had been so afraid of failing her, afraid of loving her too much, afraid that if he let himself care, fate would rip her away the way it had ripped Evelyn. But love was already here. It was in the way Elise clung to them. It was in the way they would lay down their lives for her. And for the first time, Nathan wondered if he was brave enough to do the same. The night was eerily still. The sprawling estate, surrounded by towering iron gates and endless acres of land, stood like a fortress against the cold December wind. Inside, Nathan Calloway sat in his study, staring blankly at the flickering glow of the fireplace. The glass of whiskey in his hand remained untouched, condensation forming along its edges. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the echoes of memories that refused to fade. Upstairs in the nursery, Elise slept peacefully. Titan and Echo lay on either side of her crib, their massive forms barely stirring. Their ears twitched at the faintest sound, the rustling of trees outside, the occasional creak of the old mansion, even Nathan's quiet footsteps down the hall. Their instincts never rested, not when she was near. But tonight, something was different. Titan's head lifted first, his dark amber eyes narrowing. He sniffed the air, something unseen triggering a primal warning deep within him. Echo followed, his ears flattening as a low growl rumbled in his throat. A sound. Faint. Deliberate. The front gate had opened. Nathan felt it before he heard an unnatural stillness settling over the house, an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. He frowned, placing his glass down and rising to his feet. A lifetime of high-stakes business had honed his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him. His phone buzzed. Private security alert. Unauthorized entry detected. Nathan's blood ran cold. Before he could process what was happening, a sharp bark rang through the halls, not just any bark Titan's warning. Nathan bolted, his heart pounding against his ribs. By the time he reached the nursery, he found Titan and Echo standing in front of Elise's crib, their bodies rigid, their teeth bared. The hair along their spines bristled, and their growls grew deeper, more menacing. Then glass shattered. A scream. Elise stirred, whimpering in her sleep. Nathan turned, sprinting down the hall as the security alarm blared through the mansion. He reached the staircase just in time to see shadows moving across the foyer. A home invasion. There were 3 of them, dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks. They moved with precision, one disabling the security panel, another sweeping the area. The third man, taller than the others, carried a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Nathan had no time to think only to act. He reached for the drawer by the staircase table, his fingers closing around the cold steel of his handgun. His grip was steady, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just a robbery. They were here for Elise. He took a step forward, ready to confront them, but before he could make a move, a blur of golden fur shot past him. Titan. And he wasn't going to wait for them to strike again. Strengthening the defenses. The next morning, the estate transformed into something else entirely. Nathan's personal security team doubled, their presence now a permanent fixture on the grounds. High-tech surveillance systems were installed, motion sensors covered every inch of the property, and backup generators ensured nothing would be left to chance. Michael ran through the security upgrades with precision. We've got eyes on every possible entry point, reinforced doors, and thermal detection in place. If someone so much as breathes too close to this house, we'll know about it. Nathan nodded but said nothing. He still didn't feel safe. Not until he knew who was behind this. But as much as he wanted to dive headfirst into hunting them down, there was something more pressing, something he couldn't ignore anymore. Elise. She sat in the living room, nestled between Titan and Echo. She giggled as Titan nudged her tiny hand, his massive frame curled protectively around her. Echo lay at her other side, his eyes never straying from the doors. Nathan watched them from the doorway, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. He had always thought of the dogs as protectors, as weapons forged from loyalty and training. But he had been wrong. They weren't just guarding Elise. They loved her, and she loved them. He wasn't sure when the moment happened, but suddenly, Nathan found himself crossing the room, lowering himself onto the couch beside them. Titan's ears perked up, his sharp gaze meeting Nathan's as if questioning the sudden shift. Nathan hesitated before reaching out, his hand brushing over Elise's tiny fingers. She cooed softly, gripping his thumb in her impossibly small hand. A lump formed in his throat. For so long he had feared this connection, convinced that if he let himself love her, he would lose her the way he had lost Evelyn. But he had been wrong. Love didn't make him weak. It made him human. And for the first time, Nathan Calloway, ruthless billionaire, master strategist, feared by enemies, felt terrified. Not of losing her, but of failing her. A final warning. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Nathan had expected retaliation, a sign that Carter's unknown employer wasn't finished, but nothing came. Until the letter arrived. It was slipped under the estate gates in the dead of night, bypassing every security measure in place. Nathan found it on his desk the next morning, a simple envelope with no return address. He hesitated for only a moment before tearing it open. Inside, a single piece of paper. "You took something from us. We're taking something from you." Nathan's blood ran cold. A father's worst nightmare crashed over him like a tidal wave. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The dog lunged, his powerful form crashing into the nearest intruder. The man barely had time to react before he was slammed against the wall, Titan's teeth sinking into his forearm. A blood-curdling scream tore through the air. The second man spun, raising a weapon, but Echo was faster. He charged, knocking the gun clean from his hands, sending the intruder sprawling across the marble floor. Nathan raised his gun, aiming for the third man, the one who hadn't moved. The leader. Their eyes met through the dim lighting, and Nathan felt a jolt of recognition. Vincent Carter. An old enemy, a rival from the business world, someone who had once vowed revenge after Nathan exposed his corrupt dealings, shattering his empire. Nathan's finger hovered over the trigger, but before he could fire, Carter smirked. "You really thought you could ruin me and get away with it?" Carter's voice was calm, almost amused. His gaze flickered toward the hallway. "I hear you have something valuable upstairs." Rage exploded in Nathan's chest. "You're not leaving this house alive," he growled. Carter tilted his head, as if considering his words. Then, without warning, he reached into his jacket. Nathan didn't hesitate. The gunshot echoed through the mansion, deafening in the enclosed space. Carter staggered back, gripping his shoulder as blood seeped through his sleeve. The fight wasn't over. Titan and Echo had subdued the other intruders, but Carter wasn't going down so easily. He reached for the duffel bag at his feet, yanking it open. Nathan barely had time to react before he saw it. A syringe. A sedative. For Elise, time slowed. Carter took a step forward. Nathan raised his gun again. But before either of them could move, Echo lunged. The German Shepherd's jaws closed around Carter's wrist, forcing the syringe from his grasp. Carter screamed, the sound raw with pain, as Echo held on, refusing to let go. Titan, sensing the moment, moved in next. He knocked Carter clean off his feet, sending him crashing to the ground. Within seconds, both dogs had him pinned, their snarls filling the room. Nathan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The threat was over. Sirens wailed in the distance as the estate's security team finally arrived, storming through the open doors. The two other intruders were already unconscious, their bodies limp on the cold marble. Nathan didn't even spare them a glance. His feet carried him upstairs, heart hammering in his chest. He burst into the nursery, breathless, eyes immediately landing on the crib. Elise was still there. Safe. Oblivious to the chaos that had nearly stolen her away. Nathan approached, his hands trembling as he reached down, gently brushing his fingers over her soft cheek. She stirred slightly, her tiny face scrunching up before settling once more. A shaky exhale escaped him. He turned just in time to see Titan and Echo standing in the doorway, their chests rising and falling, their eyes locked onto Elise. Even now, after everything, they remained in position watching, waiting. Nathan swallowed past the lump in his throat. For years he had refused to open himself to love, to the possibility of loss. He had convinced himself that distance was the only way to protect himself from pain. But these dogs, they had never hesitated. They had given their loyalty, their devotion, their lives, without question. And in that moment, Nathan realized something. He wasn't just Elise's father. He was a part of their pack, and he would do whatever it took to protect them all. The night had settled once more, but the house no longer felt the same. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood, a stark reminder that safety was never truly guaranteed, not even within the walls of a fortress. Nathan stood by the nursery window, staring out at the vast expanse of his estate. The security lights bathed the grounds in an artificial glow, and armed guards now patrolled the perimeter. The mansion had always been heavily secured, but tonight had exposed a terrifying truth: protection was an illusion. He turned back, his gaze landing on Elise. She was still asleep, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythmic peace he had almost lost forever. A part of him wanted to pick her up, to hold her and never let go. But he hesitated. He had spent so much of her short life keeping his distance, convinced that love made people weak. He wasn't sure he knew how to hold her without breaking. A soft rustling sound broke his thoughts. Titan and Echo sat near the crib, their bodies tense, their ears flicking at every distant noise. Their fur was still damp from sweat and adrenaline, their breathing steady but watchful. They hadn't left Elise's side since the attack, and Nathan knew they never would. The weight of realization settled on his chest. He had spent his life calculating risks, ensuring every move was strategic, every outcome controlled. But love, true, unconditional love, wasn't something he could measure. It wasn't something he could keep at arm's length, no matter how hard he tried. And tonight, it had nearly been stolen from him. A sharp knock on the door pulled him back. He turned to find his head of security, Michael Grant, standing there, his face grim. "They're in custody," Michael said, stepping inside. "Carter and his men. The police have them, but—" He hesitated. They weren't acting alone. Nathan stiffened. "What do you mean?" Michael ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, clearly exhausted. "Carter was working for someone else, someone bigger. He wouldn't say who, but before the cops took him away, he left you a message." Nathan's jaw clenched. "What did he say?" Michael met his eyes. He said, "This isn't over." The words sat heavy in the room. Nathan felt the familiar stir of rage rising within him. He had spent years making enemies, taking down men who thought themselves untouchable. He had built an empire from nothing, crushing anyone who stood in his way. But he had never thought that war would come to his doorstep. He glanced at Elise again, at the small, fragile thing that had no idea the world had turned against her before she had even learned to walk. This was personal. Nathan's fingers tightened around the letter, the edges crumpling under the force of his grip. His breath was slow, controlled, but inside, something primal stirred a rage that threatened to consume him. The message was clear. They weren't finished. Across the room, Michael Grant watched him carefully. "Sir, this isn't just a threat. It's a declaration of war." Nathan exhaled sharply, tossing the letter onto the desk. "They want me to act first. They want me to be reckless." He met Michael's gaze, his voice low. "But I'm not giving them the advantage." Michael hesitated. "We need to move Elise somewhere safer. The estate is locked down, but if they got close enough to leave this," he gestured to the letter, "they'll try again." Nathan looked past him, through the large windows that overlooked the garden. There, under the morning light, Elise sat on a blanket, her tiny hands buried in Titan's thick fur. Echo lay beside them, ears flicking at every passing sound. They would die for her. But what if that wasn't enough? Nathan turned back to Michael. "Moving her, makes her vulnerable. This estate is a fortress, and I intend to keep it that way." Michael nodded, though his expression remained tense. "Then we need to be ready." Nathan's jaw clenched. He was always ready. But this was different. He wasn't just protecting his assets, his reputation, or his own life. He was protecting his daughter. And failure wasn't an option. The first strike. It happened that night. Nathan had barely slept, his mind a battlefield of strategies and contingency plans. The estate had doubled its security, every entrance guarded, every inch of the property monitored. But they didn't come through the gates. They came from the sky. Nathan woke to the shrill alarm blaring through the mansion. The security feed on his nightstand flickered to life, and his stomach dropped. A helicopter. It hovered above the property, its powerful floodlights cutting through the darkness. Figures in black tactical gear rappelled down the ropes, their movements swift and calculated. Nathan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gun and sprinted toward the nursery. The moment he burst through the door, Titan and Echo were already standing over Elise's crib, their teeth bared, their bodies bristling with tension. Elise stirred, whimpering in her sleep. Nathan's pulse roared in his ears as he positioned himself in front of her. No one was taking her. No one. A crash echoed from the hallway. Heavy boots thundered against the floor. Nathan didn't wait for them to come to him. He ran toward the fight. Titan and Echo stood, their ears flicking toward Elise as she wriggled in the maid's grasp. Nathan took a slow step forward, gently taking her into his arms. She nestled against him immediately, small and warm. His decision was made. He would disappear. For her. Vanishing from the world. By the next evening, everything was set. The estate's security remained on full alert, a front to make it seem like Nathan was still there. Meanwhile, a convoy left under the cover of darkness, heading toward an entirely different destination. Nathan sat in the back of an unmarked SUV, Elise cradled in his arms, her small breaths soft against his chest. Titan and Echo sat on either side of him, their bodies tense, as if they knew this was more than just another ride. Michael drove, his hands tight around the wheel. It's about 6 hours out. Once you're there, you're off the grid. No phone signals, no cameras, nothing. It's the safest place we have. Nathan barely responded. His mind was fixed on what came next. Langley wouldn't stop, which meant Nathan would have to end this himself. But first, he had to make sure Elise was somewhere untouchable. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding into the mountains, leaving the world behind. Nathan closed his eyes for a moment, his fingers tightening around Elise's tiny frame. Langley had made a mistake. He had tried to take the only thing that mattered. And now? Nathan was going to make him regret it. The battle for Elise. The first intruder barely had time to react before Nathan's bullet tore through his vest, sending him crashing to the floor. The second man lunged at him, knife flashing in the dim light. Nathan twisted, slamming his elbow into the attacker's ribs before driving his fist into his throat. The man choked, staggering backward, but before Nathan could finish him off, gunfire. A bullet whizzed past his ear, embedding itself in the wall behind him. Nathan ducked, rolling behind the hallway pillar as the next shot fired. From the nursery, a deafening snarl erupted. Titan. The dog launched himself at the nearest intruder, his massive jaws clamping down on the man's arm. A scream tore through the air as Titan dragged him down, shaking him violently. Echo followed, slamming his body into another attacker, sending them both crashing into the dresser. Nathan didn't waste the opportunity. He stepped out from cover and fired. 1, 2, 3. The bodies fell, but he wasn't satisfied not until he knew Elise was safe. Heart-hammering, he turned toward the nursery. Titan stood over a lifeless attacker, his muzzle drenched in blood. Echo still growled, his eyes locked on the last remaining intruder. And in the middle of it all, Elise slept peacefully. Nathan exhaled, the rush of adrenaline finally catching up to him. They had won, but it wasn't over. The name behind the attack. The aftermath was swift. The intruders were dead or captured. The helicopter was gone, its mission failed. The estate was still standing, stronger than before. But Nathan wasn't satisfied. He needed to know who had sent them. The answer came an hour later, when Michael dragged the last conscious attacker into the study. The man was bleeding, his face swollen, but his eyes burned with defiance. Nathan didn't sit. He didn't offer negotiations. He simply leveled his gun at the man's head. "Who sent you?" The man laughed, spitting blood onto the floor. "You already know." Nathan's grip tightened. Michael stepped forward, his phone in hand. "Sir, we ran facial recognition. He's connected to one of your old rivals." Nathan didn't blink. "Who?" Michael hesitated before saying the name. "Victor Langley." Nathan's blood ran cold. Langley, the man he had destroyed, the man whose empire had crumbled beneath him years ago. The man who had nothing left to lose. Nathan stepped closer to the prisoner, his voice dangerously low. "Why Elise?" The man smirked. "Because Langley doesn't want to kill you, Calloway. That's too easy. He wants you to suffer." Nathan's pulse thundered. The man leaned forward, whispering the last words with chilling finality. "And he's not done yet." The prisoner's words echoed in Nathan's mind long after Michael dragged him away. "He wants you to suffer." Nathan stood in the dimly lit study, his knuckles white as he clenched the back of his chair. The fire in the hearth flickered wildly, casting shadows against the walls, but it did nothing to warm the ice spreading through his veins. Langley. The name alone was enough to reopen old wounds, but Nathan had buried that war years ago. He had ensured Victor Langley's empire collapsed, had watched him fall from grace with his own eyes. He should have been finished. But men like Langley didn't just disappear. They rotted in the dark, waiting. And now, he had come for the one thing Nathan could not afford to lose. Elise. A deep growl pulled Nathan from his thoughts. Titan and Echo sat by the study doors, their eyes locked onto him, as if they could sense the storm brewing inside him. "They're not done," Nathan murmured. His voice was hollow, edged with something lethal. Michael re-entered the room, rubbing the tension from his temples. "The team's sweeping the estate again, reinforcing weak spots. But sir, we need a long-term solution. Langley's not going to stop." Nathan knew that. Langley was a strategist, just like him. And now that he had failed to take Elise by force, he would change tactics. He wouldn't come with guns next time. He would come with something worse. Michael hesitated before speaking again. "Sir, maybe it's time to disappear. Take Elise and go underground until we figure this out." Nathan's head snapped up, his gaze sharp. "Run?" Michael sighed. "It's not running. It's survival. We can lock this place down as much as we want, but Langley has resources. He'll keep coming, and next time, we might not be able to stop him." Nathan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. The idea of leaving everything behind made his stomach twist. He had spent his entire life fighting, standing his ground against every enemy, every threat. But Elise, she wasn't just his battle. She was innocent, and he couldn't gamble with her life. Silence stretched between them until Michael finally spoke again. "There's a safe house. Isolated, off-grid. Only a handful of people know about it. You and Elise would be invisible." Nathan stared at the fire, his mind warring against itself. He hated the thought of running, but the weight of Elise's safety crushed his pride. A soft coo echoed from the hallway. Nathan turned. Elise was there, held in the arms of one of the estate's maids. She was awake now, her small hands reaching out toward him. His chest tightened. This wasn't just a decision about strategy. It was about being a father. The safe house was nothing like the grand estate Nathan had left behind. It was buried deep in the mountains, hidden between towering pines, a fortress of thick concrete and steel. No windows, no cameras, no connection to the outside world. Just silence and the weight of isolation. Nathan stood at the threshold, Elise in his arms, her tiny face pressed against his chest. Titan and Echo moved ahead, their massive bodies gliding through the darkened space, noses twitching as they scanned for danger. There was none. At least none yet. Michael placed a heavy duffel bag on the worn wooden table. "Supplies should last for months," he said. "Guns, food, medical kits. If anyone tries to get close, you'll know before they do." Nathan nodded but didn't speak. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the past, in the mistakes that had led to this moment. This was his fault. His war. And now Elise was paying the price. Michael hesitated. "You sure about this? About being alone?" Nathan exhaled sharply, shifting Elise in his arms. "I need to keep her safe." Michael didn't argue. He knew better. Instead, he simply clapped Nathan on the shoulder. "I'll be back when it's time." And just like that, he was gone. Nathan stood there, listening to the sound of the SUV disappearing down the long, winding road. Then, for the first time in years, he was truly alone. The weight of silence. Days passed, maybe weeks. Nathan didn't know anymore. Time stretched endlessly in the mountains, measured only by the steady rhythm of Elise's breathing and the quiet hum of the wind outside. He spent his days en route and checking the perimeter, reinforcing the security systems, keeping his weapons close. At night he barely slept, his mind haunted by the possibility that Langley would find them. But the worst part? It was the waiting. The endless, suffocating silence. Elise was too young to understand what was happening. She played, giggled, reached for his face with chubby hands that held no fear of the world. She trusted him completely. And that trust terrified him. Because what if he failed her? What if this wasn't enough? What if Langley won? He ran a hand over his face, his exhaustion weighing heavier than the guns strapped to his back. His reflection in the bathroom mirror was almost unrecognizable and shaven, hollow-eyed, a man on the edge of something dangerous. Titan and Echo never left his side. They knew, they always knew. They could sense the war raging inside him, the battle between guilt and fury, love and fear. And for the first time, Nathan didn't know which side would win. The truth comes knocking. It happened late one night. Elise was asleep, curled against Titan's warm side. Echo sat by the door, his ears flicking toward the smallest of sounds. Nathan sat on the floor, gun in hand, staring into nothing. Then, a soft chime. The satellite phone. The only connection to the outside world. Nathan grabbed it, his grip tight as he pressed it to his ear. "Talk." Michael's voice was sharp. "We found something." Nathan straightened. "What?" A pause. Then, "Langley doesn't want you dead. He doesn't even want revenge." Nathan's stomach turned to ice. "Then what the hell does he want?" Michael hesitated. Then he spoke, and his words sent a chill down Nathan's spine. "He wants Elise." Silence. Nathan's hand curled into a fist. "Why?" Michael exhaled. "Because she's not just your daughter, Nathan." Nathan's pulse roared in his ears. "What the hell are you talking about?" Another pause. Then, "Elise is Langley's granddaughter." Nathan felt his entire world tilt. "Elise is Langley's granddaughter." Michael's words echoed in his head, but they didn't make sense. No, they couldn't make sense. Elise was his daughter, his blood, his only connection to Evelyn. His grip tightened on the phone. "You're wrong." Michael sighed on the other end. "I wish I was. But we dug deep, Nathan. Langley had a son. You remember Christopher Langley?" Nathan's stomach twisted. Christopher had been nothing like his father, a quiet man, brilliant but unambitious. He had vanished from the corporate world years ago, leaving Langley behind. Michael continued. "He changed his name, tried to start over, and he met Evelyn." Nathan's breath caught in his throat. "Number." Michael didn't stop. "Evelyn was pregnant when she married you, Nathan. She never told you. She wanted to protect Elise from the Langley name." Nathan staggered back, his free hand gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. The room felt smaller, suffocating. "Elise isn't Langley's target because of you," Michael said. "She's his heir." A cold dread slithered through Nathan's veins. Langley didn't just want Elise. He wanted to claim her. A sickening realization settled over Nathan. Langley had no intention of killing Elise. He wanted to take her, to shape her, to turn her into an extension of his empire. And that was something Nathan would never allow. His voice was ice. "Where is he?" Michael hesitated. "Nathan, where is he?" A pause. Then, "Langley's in New York, but listen to me. You go after him now. You're walking into a trap. He knows you'll come for him." Nathan's jaw clenched. "Good." Michael cursed under his breath. "At least wait for backup." "I don't have time," Nathan snapped. "Every second we wait, he gets closer to finding us." He turned, his gaze landing on Elise. She was still asleep, nestled safely between Titan and Echo. Nathan's heart ached. She had no idea the war that raged around her. Michael exhaled. "Then I'm coming with you." "No," Nathan said immediately. "I need you to stay here. If anything happens to me, Elise needs someone who can keep her safe." Michael was silent for a long moment. Then, reluctantly, he said, "All right." "But Nathan?" "What?" "Finish it." Nathan hung up. He had made his decision. This wouldn't end with more running. This wouldn't end with hiding. This would end with Langley dead. The confrontation. Nathan stepped forward, his gun leveled. "It's over." Langley turned slowly, a smirk twisting his face. He was older now, his once powerful presence dulled by age, but the malice in his eyes burned just as bright. "Nathan," he said smoothly, as if greeting an old friend, "you always did have a flair for the dramatic." Nathan's finger tightened on the trigger. "You sent men to take my daughter." Langley sighed, shaking his head. "No, Nathan. I sent men to retrieve my granddaughter." A sickening wave of fury crashed through Nathan's veins. "She is not yours." Langley's expression darkened. "She is blood. She is legacy. And you?" He chuckled. "You're nothing but a thief. You stole my son's child, raised her as if she were yours. But you can't change fate, Nathan. She belongs to the Langley family." Nathan took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Elise belongs to no one but herself." Langley's smirk returned. "And what will you do? Kill me?" He gestured to the security cameras overhead. "My men are watching. The second you pull that trigger, they'll tear you apart." Nathan didn't blink. "Then I guess I'd better make the shot count." Langley's smile finally faltered. For the first time, he saw the lethal certainty in Nathan's gaze, the unshakable resolve of a man who had already made peace with death. Langley took a careful step back. "You don't have to do this." Nathan tilted his head. "You're right." Then he fired. The end of Victor Langley. The bullet struck Langley's shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground with a guttural scream. Nathan advanced, his gun still raised. "You don't deserve a quick death," Nathan said, his voice like steel. "You don't deserve an easy way out." Langley gasped for breath, his face contorted in agony. You're making a mistake." Nathan crouched down, gripping Langley's collar, forcing him to look into his eyes. "The only mistake was letting you live this long." Langley's breathing hitched, and for the first time in his miserable existence, he looked afraid. Nathan released him, stepping back. "You'll rot in a cell for the rest of your life." The sound of sirens filled the air. Michael had done his part. The authorities stormed the estate moments later. Nathan stepped aside as armed agents flooded the room, their weapons trained on Langley. As they dragged him away, Langley's eyes locked onto Nathan's one final time. "You can't protect her forever." Nathan's lips curled into a smirk. "Watch me." And with that, Victor Langley was gone. Forever. The last goodbye. Nathan strapped the last of his weapons into place, his mind clear, his heart steady. He would leave before dawn, before Elise woke. It would be easier that way. But as he turned to leave, a small sound stopped him. Elise. She stirred, her tiny hands reaching for the warmth beside her. But when she didn't find it, her face scrunched up, a soft whimper escaping her lips. Titan and Echo immediately shifted closer, their bodies forming a protective cocoon around her. Nathan swallowed hard. He should leave. He had to leave. But he didn't. Instead, he walked forward and knelt beside the bed. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Her tiny fingers curled around his thumb, even in sleep. His throat tightened. "You're safe here," he whispered, "and you always will be." Titan lifted his head, his amber eyes locking onto Nathan's. The dog had sensed his master's decision long before it was spoken. Nathan exhaled. "Take care of her." Titan didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Nathan understood the message in his gaze. "We always will." With one last look at his daughter, the only thing in this world that truly mattered, Nathan rose to his feet and walked out the door. He wasn't coming back until Langley was dead. Nathan had faced danger before. He had built an empire in a world where only the ruthless survived. He had stared down men who would kill for half the fortune he had, men who had tried to destroy him. But this was different. This wasn't about money or power. This was about Elise. Langley had made a critical mistake. He had threatened Nathan's daughter, and there was no force in the world more dangerous than a father with nothing left to lose. The SUV cut through the empty streets of New York, its engine a low growl against the silence of the night. Nathan gripped the wheel, his jaw tight, his thoughts razor-sharp. Langley's estate was a fortress, but Nathan had spent years dismantling empires. He knew exactly where to strike. Tonight, it ended. The final infiltration. Nathan parked half a mile away and moved on foot. The mansion loomed ahead, a massive structure of stone and steel, hidden behind towering iron gates. Security was tight guards at every entrance, surveillance cameras, tracking every movement. But Nathan was faster, smarter. He moved through the shadows, silent as death, cutting through the blind spots he had already mapped in his mind. He took out the first guard with a knife to the throat, catching the body before it hit the ground. The second never even saw the bullet coming. He scaled the side of the estate, his gloved hands gripping the stone ledges as he pulled himself upward. Years of combat training had prepared him for moments like this. He reached the balcony, slipping inside through the glass doors. And there, standing by the fireplace, was Victor Langley, waiting for him. The storm had passed. Nathan stood at the edge of the safe house's porch, watching as the first rays of dawn crept over the mountains. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was still caught in the echoes of the past few days, the gunfire, the chase, Langley's final words. "You can't protect her forever." Nathan exhaled slowly. He didn't have to. Because Elise wasn't alone. Behind him, the door creaked open. Soft, tiny footsteps followed, and a moment later, Elise's small hand curled around his finger. She was awake. Nathan glanced down, his heart tightening at the sight of her sleepy expression. Her eyes, still heavy with sleep, searched his face with quiet curiosity. She didn't know what he had done for her, what he had sacrificed. She didn't need to. Elise reached up, her tiny arms stretching toward him in a silent request. Without hesitation, Nathan lifted her into his arms, pressing her close. Her warmth, her weight against his chest, it was grounding, real. She was safe. That was all that mattered. A family reunited. Inside the cabin, Titan and Echo lay near the fireplace, their eyes flicking toward Nathan as he stepped inside with Elise. Their ears perked up, sensing the shift in the air. Nathan knelt beside them, his free hand running through Titan's thick fur. "You did good," he murmured. "Better than I ever could." Titan let out a low huff, pressing his massive head into Nathan's chest. Echo followed, his tail thumping softly against the wooden floor. Nathan swallowed hard. These dogs hadn't just protected Elise, they had protected him. For years he had been alone, convinced that attachments only led to pain. He had built walls around himself, had refused to feel. But Titan and Echo had shattered those walls without ever speaking a word. And Elise? She had taught him how to love again. Nathan tightened his hold on her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm done running," he whispered. "We're going home." Titan let out a quiet, approving growl. Echo simply rested his head against Nathan's knee. And for the first time in his life, Nathan Calloway knew he wasn't alone. The road home. Days later, they returned to the estate. It was different now. Not a fortress, not a prison, just a home. Security remained tight, but Nathan no longer felt the suffocating weight of paranoia. Langley was gone, and Elise's future was hers to shape. Nathan spent less time in his office and more time with her. He learned how to make her laugh, how to comfort her when she cried, how to be more than just a protector. Titan and Echo remained by her side, her silent guardians, always watching, always waiting. Nathan knew one day Elise would grow up, and she wouldn't need them as much. But for now, she was still his little girl. Still their little girl. And as the sun set over the vast estate, Nathan stood at the window, Elise curled up on his chest, Titan and Echo at his feet. For the first time in forever he felt peace. Because this wasn't just a house. This was family. Love isn't about blood, it's about loyalty. About the ones who stand by your side when the world turns against you. Nathan thought he had everything. But he didn't truly live until he learned to love. What would you fight for? What would you protect at all costs? If this story moved you, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Because sometimes, family isn't just who you're born, it's who you choose.